All right, we're recording. Okay, so for today's class, you guys went ahead and planned the other prompt. How'd this one go?
It was.
I think it's a more difficult question in certain
It
ways.
was easier to understand, but harder to come up with ideas for.
Okay, okay. The reason why it actually says obey the prompt on the backboard is because after this class yesterday, I went to lunch kind of frustrated and surprised that there were in my, in what I sort of think of as one of my smart sections, that there were a whole bunch of you who didn't understand the prompt. And so I was talking with a colleague and he said, you know what you need to tell them? And I said, what? He said, you need to tell them to obey the prompt.
I'm gonna write that down.
You obey the prompt. And in a Ten Commandments kind of way, thou shalt have no other prompts but me. You don't come into the test saying, I know what I'm going to write about today. You write about whatever the prompt tells you to write about. Again, if you don't answer the prompt, if you don't obey the prompt, it's like you lose so many points just because of that. What I thought I would do today, which I'm hoping you'll find helpful, is I'm going to pretend I'm a student and I'm going to try to capture everything I'm thinking, which is kind of tough because I think you think a lot faster than you speak and a lot faster than you write. But I'm going to do a think aloud. So if I were a student and I had this prompt in front of me, what is my thinking process? How do I go about answering an essay question? What do I think about when I'm reading? What do I think about when I'm planning? I'm hoping that this will be helpful for you so that you see what someone who's more experienced, kind of how they go about it. It doesn't mean that this is the right way or this is the only way, but it is an effective way to do it. Yeah.
I had a question about like the test.
Sure.
Are we? We'll have to come up with specific details from the book, I imagine. So will we be allowed to use the book?
No, you study.
Study the book.
Yeah. Like study all your quizzes that you got back.
Oh, yeah. That makes
Study your
sense.
annotations. I would look it over, look at what I highlighted, look at what I annotated. Yeah, you want to be deeply familiar with the specifics of the book. That certainly helps. Any other questions before we get started? So what I would recommend to you is while I'm doing this is not so much to write down the content of how I'm answering the question, like not the what of the answer, but what are questions I ask myself that kind of help me get going, and what are questions that maybe you're not asking yourself in your planning process that would be helpful for you to start asking in your planning process. Does that make sense? Okay, so now if there's any questions, if you could just wait till the end, because when you're planning in real life, you don't have someone interrupting you. And that might mess up my train of thought a little bit. So I haven't really thought too much about this question. I knew it was a good question for 1984, and that's why I gave it to you guys to practice as a prompt with. But I haven't nailed out my answer or anything like that, because then it would sort of ruin this exercise. All right, so we start with just reading the questions. Critic Roland Barthes has said, literature is the question minus the answer. Consider Barthes' observation and how it relates to 1984. Then write an essay in which you analyze a central question the text raises and the extent to which it offers answers. Explain how the author's treatment of this question affects your understanding of the work as a whole. Avoid plot summary. All right, so you can already see I've underlined sort of directionally what they're telling me to do, what I need to make sure I include. So I've got 3 points underlined, so I know that I definitely, it's not that that's going to be my 3 paragraphs, but I need to sort of juggle 3 things as I'm sort of trying to plan here. So a central question that the text raises, and then the extent to which it offers answers, and then finally, this is really sort of what you do in a conclusion. The conclusion part is bringing it to the whole, right? Getting kind of zooming out and getting it to the holistic understanding. So what I really need to focus here with my plan, I do need to make sure that whatever I focus on does eventually get to the work as a whole. But certainly I'm going to first focus on the central question, a central question that the text raises. And I note that it asks for only one. It wants one question. And then the extent to which it offers answers, interesting, one question, several answers. Now there's a bunch of different ways that I could go with this, but I do want to lean toward, if I want to shoot for an A, I want to lean toward a question where it shows I can wrestle with ambiguity and complexity. So I don't want an easy question. I don't want a question with an obvious answer of if you read the book and understood it, here's the clear answer, because books do more than that, right? So I want to think about sort of a question that maybe I've actually thought about, or maybe that we've talked about in class, but maybe haven't necessarily directly discussed in detail. For me, and it might be because I tend to like the more philosophical questions, I sort of can't help but go to the question when I think of like what were the conversations I was most interested in having, and it's the what does it mean to be human question. To me, that's a clear question that the book raises. What does it mean to be human? And I guess part of it is, in a game theory way, there's one point where he talks about how his goal is to stay human. So it's clear to me that Orwell is raising that question. So that might be something, that little detail, goal to stay human. That might be a nice detail to include in my intro to show that I'm not asking the text this question, that it's clear Orwell is raising the question. That if you've got a character whose goal is to stay human, then obviously there's some discussion about, well, what does that mean? And so I'm going to think back all the way to part one, and I'm going to try to sort of think through the story chronologically, and that might help me come up with some possible answers that Orwell gives us. So I'm just going to think, in the beginning with the down with Big Brother, that's something that comes to mind. That gets into the id. The idea that we are impulsive beings, maybe. Sometimes our impulses go against our better judgments. It makes me wonder, if I think of it that way, if one of the possible answers is that we are impulsive beings, what else other than, or in addition to Down with Big Brother, I could probably talk about Room 101 in the sense of we are impulsive beings. In some sense, his decision to immediately, trust Julia and immediately say like, oh, she loves me, great, I'm obsessed with her now, is a rather impulsive decision. So that might be something else I could talk about if I want to defend that that's one of the answers. Again, I think it's one of several answers. He also immediately trusts O'Brien. Just doing some shorthand there. I think pretty clearly when I think about part one, in some ways he says it's the idea we are thinking beings. Maybe that's what it means to be human, that we are thinking beings. And we think so much about this book is about being able to control your own thinking, and that's part of him being human. Being able to control your own thoughts. So that's one way. We are empathetic beings. That made me, now where did I get that from? Again, in some ways I'm still thinking about part one. But, when I first read the book, something shocking about chapter one was when he goes to the flicks, and there's like the Jewish woman who is holding her baby, and they're getting blown up, and everyone in the theater is laughing. And to me, I think that was one of the first eerie scenes where it felt inhuman to me. When I think about how Julia and Winston meet, it almost seems like Julia sort of tests out his degree of humanity, of if I fall, will he offer to help me up? Like, is that an instinct in him? Is that part of him? And maybe in some way that's sort of testing his humanity. So I'm just gonna jot that down. So the Flakes, chapter 1, and then meeting Julia, that'll help. I'm still thinking early chapters. Okay, maybe I need to start thinking about part 2, what it means to be human. Part 2 makes me want to say we are loving beings. Maybe that's what this is really about. Human, is it that humans are meant to love? It is in our nature to love. I think we certainly see that when we think about the relationship between Julia and Winston. And when he makes that goal to stay human, what does that mean in that moment? It seems to mean to have a loyalty to Julia and an allegiance to Julia. Loyalty, love, allegiance to Julia. When I think about the exercise that we did where we drew sort of the plot structure and all the different groups came up with different diagrams, and then I came up here and did some diagrams. And when I think about what a protagonist is, one who strives, when I think about how the book ends and why that's such a clear sort of moment of resolution, it's because the struggle is over. So does that mean that what makes us human is that we are struggling beings? We struggle, it's in our nature, this is what we do. I would talk about the end if I went with that one. All right, I feel like I've generated quite a few answers. Being that this is a timed essay, I don't think I'll actually be able to get to all of them. I like what I've come up with. I don't think I have the time to have 5 body paragraphs where I say, here's one answer, here's another answer, here's another answer. Maybe if it was untimed, I could get into all of them. But I feel like maybe I should stop generating ideas and start editing, start sort of picking and choosing which are my strongest ones. I do think, to me, this is a clear winner. In that, not necessarily the answer, but definitely something that I would like to discuss, because then, I can also get into a little bit of Aristotle if I want, as humans are rational beings. That's nice to be able to put it in context a little bit if you can do that. I feel like I can kind of combine these. Empathy is not the same thing as love. I guess if I had to choose one word-wise, I would probably say we are loving beings. And then I could, if I wanted to, sort of show that the love extends to empathy. Empathy is a type of love. So I might do that. So part of it is also recognizing what is the relationship between the ideas I have. When is it really a totally separate idea, and when is it like a pretty related idea, not exactly the same, but something that you could kind of like tuck under. Does that make sense? Like tuck under the loving being. To me, I feel like getting to room 101, and discussing something about the end is critical to this question that I'm raising of what it means to be human. It's funny because in the end he says he loves Big Brother, but he definitely seems hollow, and it seems he's not human anymore. He's just an empty body. So it wouldn't be that. Maybe I'll do struggling. I kind of like that. That's something different. That's something new. We haven't really talked about it in that way at all. I think we've mentioned things like this in class before, but we haven't mentioned that one, so I'd like to include that one. I've got examples throughout. I mean, the end certainly gets to sort of the ultimate, and here's how it shows that this is one answer to the question. But really, the whole book, he's struggling, right? The whole book is fighting against authority. That's a nice holistic take on it. I mean, I could literally open up any page of the book and I could show you Winston as a struggling being. Maybe that's the answer. I came into the question, initially when I started the question, I thought, this is more of the answer than anything else. So much of this book is like about doublethink and that whole notion. I can get into language here if I wanted to, right? About how the limited language limits your thinking. There's so much in part one about the thinking. But ultimately in the end, I mean, he stops thinking, but it's also that he stops struggling. I don't know. I need to figure out which one is really stronger. I could go either way. I think I'm going to do this as the last one, though. I think that could be the strongest answer here. Plus, the other thing is this feels very part one to me. Like it's heavier in part one than anywhere else, and that's more part two. And really, part three is about getting him to stop fighting, right? Like the whole point of the torture is to get him to stop struggling and just accept it and willingly and voluntarily love Big Brother. That's like all you need to do. Ooh, when we think about that last paragraph, and was it self-willed exile, oh, needless misunderstanding? If I can get a quote in there, that'd be kind of awesome. Oh, needless misunderstanding. Something like that. I don't know if it's exactly that, but it's close to it. Self-willed exile, I remember that. From the loving breast, yes. Okay, yes. Okay, making progress. Yeah, okay, so now what I've also done here is think about, I'm going to go back to the question. Because I've made some progress, but I want to go back to the question, make sure I'm on track here. Okay, write an essay in which you analyze a central question the text raises and the extent to which it offers answers. Explain how the author's treatment of this question affects your understanding of the work as a whole. I guess when I was thinking about the relationship between the parts, and I was telling myself which is sort of the most correct, in some way that's what I was doing here. I was saying ultimately, how does Orwell define what it means to be human? Right? Aristotle's done that. I'm sure someone else has done, religion does that, tends to. I could do, ooh, that could be interesting. And maybe this is Orwell's voice. It's also sort of a more modern voice, the idea that all we do is struggle. So while he offers three answers, actually offers more than three answers, but while he offers these three answers that I'm going to write about, ultimately the understanding of the work as a whole is that among these three answers, the struggling being wins out. That's ultimately how Orwell is contributing to that, centuries-old debate about what it means to be human. And then you think about basically what it means to be human is to struggle. And when you give up and you stop struggling, that's when you're no longer human. Kind of reminds me of the do not go gently into the night.
Yeah.
That gentle night. You know that poem?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, that's kind of interesting. I mean, I could give a little shout out in my conclusion to that poem if I wanted to, but I could just keep it to 1984. And again, the conclusion is where we sort of zoom out from the question answer, right? The question answer is the focus in, right? The microscope where we're kind of zooming in. Now it's time to zoom out in the conclusion and to say ultimately that what it means to be human is to struggle. Do not go gentle into that good night. not go, is it do not go gentle into,
Do not go gently into bed.
tender, that's not tender night.
It's good night.
It's what?
I think it's good.
I think it's good night, but it sounds wrong to me. Do not go gentle into good night. To the good night.
I
Okay.
think it's that good night.
Thy good night?
That good night.
That good night. That sounds right. Do not go gentle into that good night. Okay. Anyway, again, that's just a side note. That's a little salt and pepper on top. All right, so because I figured out that this is really kind of part 1, part 2, part 3, what's nice is I figured out my order. That makes it easy. And ultimately, of course, the answer is at the end of the book. What are we left with, right? After he strips this away, right? Even under torture, we still see Winston as being human, partially because he still loves Julia. But even then, he's still human until the very, very end, until he gives up the struggle, and then he's no longer human. Yes, I'm convinced. I've convinced myself. Hopefully I can convince the person who's reading this. Okay, so while I've got ideas, these actually could work as topic sentences in the sense of, I'm going to prove that Orwell suggests we are thinking beings, right? Like I can basically just use that. All right, so what I do want to do is make sure that I have a sentence that I can use in my plan, from my plan that I can use in my essay, and then that way the essay will just be much easier to write through and kind of keep focused. So Orwell suggests we are thinking beings in part 1. In part 2, Orwell builds the idea that we are loving beings. Ultimately, in part 3, Orwell demonstrates we are struggling beings. All right, so I've articulated the point of each paragraph. I know exactly what I'm going to prove in every single paragraph. I thought about the order. Yay, all nice. Now, last but not least, I need to articulate my thesis. And before I do that, I need to reread the prompt. Literature is the question minus the answer. Write an essay in which you analyze a central question the text raises and the extent to which it offers answers. Explain how the author's treatment of this question affects your understanding of the work as a whole. Okay, it's not going to be perfect, but again, it's a timed essay. All right, in Orwell's 1984, I don't like it. In 1984, Orwell joins the centuries-old debate. What does it mean? Maybe in 1984, Orwell, no, I like joins the debate. It's a little different. Shows I understand the question, but it's a little different. In 1984, Orwell joins the centuries-old debate. What does it mean to be human? Maybe it's Orwell joins the centuries-old debate and I want something about how he explores, maybe it's that he explores the debate. Explores, and okay, in 1984, Orwell explores answers to the centuries-old debate, what does it mean to be human? Okay, so the reason I kept scratching out here, I certainly wanted an action verb. This is a little bit different. I don't have action verbs here, but that's because I'm defining what it means to be human. I mean, the question itself calls for a state of being, hence all the being. So it makes sense to use a state of being verb there. But I certainly want to use strong action verbs where I can. And it's not that he just joins the debate, but I think I wanted something about exploring answers. So it shows I've got my question as part of my thesis, and I'm showing that he doesn't just offer a single answer, but there's several answers offered in 1984. In 1984, Orwell explores the answers to the centuries-old debate. what does it mean to be human? And I think I'm ready to write. I'm pretty happy with that. All right. Over to you. Questions? Yep.
How long should we spend doing this kind of planning, outlining?
Yeah, it took me a while. It would be much shorter if I didn't say it out loud. You know, I would say for you, if you have 50 minutes to write an essay, I would take about 15 to plan it. And I know what some of you are thinking. I don't have 15 minutes to waste on planning, but I could crank this puppy out now in about 25 minutes. This isn't going to take me that long to write because I already have all the ideas. I already have all my examples, right? Writing is a really complicated skill. It's really like, we call it a writing skill, but it's really like 40 skills. It's really like 40 skills at once, right? And so if you don't do this, you're trying to juggle 40 balls at once. So if you plan, you pick up 20 balls, and they're the heavier balls, and they're bigger balls, and you juggle them all at once, and then you say, okay, planning's done, and you put those 20 balls aside, and then you get to pick up 20 lighter balls that are about the right size, what you need to juggle balls, like the size of a tennis ball. Then you can actually start thinking about transitions and sentence structure and, you know, using precise language. There's no way I can think about using precise language if I don't even know what the heck I'm going to say, or how I'm going to prove it, or what I'm going to prove specifically in that paragraph. So I've already figured out all of the idea development, right? And I've got my organization down. So now it's cohesion, it's sentence structure, it's tone, it's voice, it's vocabulary. Now I can think about those things when I write. So 15 minutes.
So would you say that like writing a more concise, well-planned essay is more important than just writing like a longer essay, or like an essay that you think should be a specific length because it's how you've usually done it?
It's not
Does that
about
make sense?
length. It's about the quality of the argument.
So yes.
And the argument needs quality defense.
Yes.
So does it have to be 3 pages because for some reason you have it in your head that it's supposed to be 3 pages? No. But if you only write a page, you haven't developed the idea. You certainly haven't defended the idea. So it's not like there's one right answer to what is an appropriate length. I mean, to me, if I were to handwrite, it also depends on, you know, like your writing. If you write bigger, if you write smaller. You know, I don't know, two pages, like a front as one page and then a back as another page. I don't know. I guess that sounds about right. Is the question about length or what?
Well, it was
What's the
more
real
about
question?
like length, yes, but more like paragraphs. Like I feel like for
Do you
every
have to
single-
have 3 paragraphs? No.
No, but I feel like for every single like timed essay I've done, my entire life probably, it's been like 5 paragraphs.
Oh, well, when we get into argument, we're going to talk about other patterns of organization that would not
And
be
this
5
isn't
paragraphs.
arguably right.
This is it's an analytical interpretation. So you're doing
Yeah.
some analyzing, you're doing some arguing.
Yeah.
To me, I happen, again, if this was not timed, I would have written about every single one of these.
Yeah.
I would have had a 7-paragraph essay.
Yeah.
But because it's under timed circumstances, I don't have time to deal with 5 body paragraphs. So I picked my strongest ones. And when I realized what I was doing, and part of it was because of how I went about thinking about the prompt, I said, start at the beginning. What do you remember from chapter 1? And I kind of went through the book chronologically in my head, in sort of a fast forward kind of way. And then when I realized this is what he offers as an answer in part 1, and this is what he offers in part 2, and that's what he offers in part 3, that works for what I'm arguing, but you didn't have to break it up that way. Like you could have just said, you know, you could have picked 2, and you could have said he argues that we are thinking beings, he argues we are loving beings, you know, now thinking back to it, why the heck did I not say we are selfish beings? Right, now that I'm like kind of out of that zone, I didn't study for this. So you also saw me going in cold. If I studied for this, that would not have been an after. That's central, right? Maybe selfish instead of struggling. I would still pick struggling. No. Maybe I'll do a fourth paragraph. I feel like the selfish thing is important. If I did, I would go 1, 2, 3. I would still end with this because I think that's still my strongest case. Because I still think that that's ultimately what we understand at the end of the book. And that the selfish being, then it's not about part 1, part 2, part 3. Or it would be, part 3 is a 3-parter. Certainly see this as Room 101. But we also see that when he steals the chocolate from his mom and sister. Maybe the part 1, part 2, part 3 is silly here. I would go 1, 2, 3, 4. Yeah, so I've got six paragraphs. I can do that. I can pull it off. Yeah, there's nothing magical about the number 3. Yes?
How would you go about studying for it then?
How would you study this?
Like, how would you study for it?
I would get my nose in the book. I would look at my annotations. I would look at what I highlighted. I would look at the scribbles in my book and my post-it notes. You've seen my book. I would look over my quizzes. I would think about the book holistically. Every single prompt I've given you.
What do you mean by that? Because I feel like when
What
I think
is
holistic,
Orwell?
I think like hippie mom. Like what's the
No.
term you're using?
As a whole,
Oh.
wow. So English teachers almost always ask you part to whole questions. In the same way that science teachers tend to ask you part to whole questions. Do you understand how the part functions within the whole? Right?
Okay.
That's how people tend to, that's not the only kind of question, because sometimes it's here are 2 options, pick the strongest one and defend it. That's the other type of question that we tend toward. But it's part to whole questions. So you need to understand the book as a whole. Again, I've already given you, I think in 4 or 5 different iterations of the same question. What is Orwell arguing? What is he trying to teach you? What is he trying to convince you of? Not about Winston and Julia, about how you live your life, how you think of what it means to be human, right? About the human condition, about love, about relationships, about how you feel about yourself and understand yourself. Again, when we think back to Why I Write, right? The essay that we read before we even opened 1984. He said that the strongest motivation he has is political purpose. That doesn't mean writing about governments, right? It's about trying to persuade you, right? So what is he trying to persuade you to think? How is he trying to change you, the reader? Maybe you should write that down as a 5th or 6th iteration of the same question. You want to know what holistic understanding of a book is? You've got to try to answer those questions. So that's the other thing I would do in studying. What is his point? How is he trying to change the reader? How is he trying to change the thinking of the reader? Has this book not changed you at all? I think most students feel changed after this book. Especially when you think about other books, I mean, especially, I think Room 101 is for a lot of students, one of the hardest scenes to read. Because most of you are still in a love conquers all, true love wins, and he's poo-pooing that. He's saying, no it doesn't, you're selfish, right? That's what he's saying. He's saying you can tell yourself that all you want. But ultimately, when push comes to shove, you will choose you in the end. And that's kind of a really harsh mirror to hold up to yourself. I mean, if you really sort of examine yourself and think about that, and again, we can make intellectual decisions that we're stronger than Winston and that we wouldn't do that. But when you really face the ugliness in the mirror and you really think about it, he is giving you something to think about. It's not something pleasant to think about, but it certainly changes, I think, the way we see our relationships, maybe the way that we see our own weakness. Are we courageous enough to do what Winston couldn't? Or are we more like him? You know, is our fear stronger than love? Does that make sense?
Yes.
Right? The language question, right? I mean, it almost feels like it's already been fleshed out because we read politics in the English language. Right? He's already shown how it's important and significant beyond 1984. I mean, that's the idea, right? The takeaway beyond the story. Right? Why do people still refer to this book? All the time. It's not because it's a fun story, right? It's because of the power of the book. So what is that power? Right? And if I say, what is the power of the book? You're like, okay, I don't even understand the question. But if I say, what is he trying to convince you of? He's using the narrative as an example to demonstrate an argument. So what is he arguing? To me, that's more clear than what is the power of the book. But maybe what is the power of this book helps you in some way. What is the power of the book beyond the story, beyond the construction of the story? So this is not in a rhetorical analysis kind of way. This is, why does this book matter in real life? Why should everyone be reading this book? Does that help? Did that help clarify? Okay. So I would get with a group of friends. I might try that out on my own, and then get with a couple friends and say, hey, you listed holistic understandings. I listed holistic understandings. Let's share what we think. Let's debate. Let's respectfully challenge each other if we don't see how it lines up. When we did the exercise the other day where you analyzed part 1, part 2, part 3, certain sections came up with a lot of different topics and other sections didn't come up with a lot of different topics. So you also want to think about, what are all the different topics he touches on? The topic is not the theme. The topic is not the holistic understanding. But if you've got a good list of topics, then you can say, okay, so one of the topics is human nature. That's what I went with. One of the topics is nature of reality, right? I could have gone that way, right? What is real? How do we know what is real? I mean, he certainly explores that question in the book. So maybe if you listed topics and then created, thinking about the topic, so what does he argue about the nature of reality? What does he argue about what it means to be human? What does he argue about the relationship between citizen and government? What does he argue about love? What does he argue about authority?
Are all of our tests going to be this prompt format when we write an essay?
Yeah.
How are the grades on this first test usually? Are they bad?
They're usually better than your summer reading ones, but it totally depends on the kid.
Really? Oh, because
Totally depends on the kid.
I'm doomed.
There's always some kid who does really, really well and just, surprises me. And to me, you saw, I kept it a little contained, but hopefully you saw that, why is she getting excited? Did you see me getting excited? Thanks, Chris. Chris saw me getting excited.
You were hyped.
And because I came up with something that we hadn't talked about. And I was like, ooh, but it makes total sense, right? Now we haven't analyzed it in this way. I'm gonna analyze it on the spot. look, I can critically think without everyone else in the class's help, or without Ms. Gellin's help. Look what I can do. That's also what you're doing, right? That's how you get in the running for an A. You've got to take a risk. If all you're doing is giving me a nice, neat version of what we've already fleshed out in class, you can still do pretty well. Like, if you do a fantastic job, you might be able to get like a B+. But if you're not bringing anything new to the table, you're not breaking in the 90s. You're just not. You got to bring it. And this now all counts as group discussion. Because you've seen me define it as struggling beings. So now if you use that, I'm like, oh, they liked my idea, did they? It's not your idea. No. You want to try to bring your ideas to the table. Now, what you don't want to do is say, oh my God, nothing is brand new in my plan. I can't move forward till there's something brand new in my plan. You don't want to do that, right? When it's 15 minutes, you move on and you start writing. You cannot come in during your lunch period. You cannot come in after class. It's not middle school. Even when I taught middle school, I didn't let them do that because it offers cheating as a possibility. You don't do that, no. So 15 minutes, you gotta move on. Yes.
So the prompt, this particular prompt, it mentions a quote with an author.
Yeah.
And I'm just not sure, I've never been sure how much we have to reference that particular author.
Not at all. I mean, that's the question. The question says, this just says consider it. Think about how it relates to 1984. Write an essay. That's where it's like, and here's the prompt. It's like intro to the prompt. Yeah, that's
So we don't have to say Orwell agrees or just.
No.
Okay.
No, because it's not asking if Orwell agrees with it.
Like kind of
Is
just,
it?
it's like
No.
a prelude. Kind of
It's a
leads
prelude.
you into
Yes, it's
the-
an introduction or a prelude to the question. Other questions? Anything about planning, the test? Were you able to kind of, other than my content, was this helpful?
Oh yeah. I
To
think
sort of
so.
see my process? And hopefully part of what you're seeing is, do I have nice, neat Roman numerals? And capital A, and little number 1, and little number 2? No. My guess is, if I had to put money on it, that in the past, you've had to create outlines and hand in the outline with the paper. And you wrote the paper first, and then you wrote the formal outline to match the paper. Raise your hand if you've done this before. I did that as a kid.
Oh.
It was always ridiculous, because, yeah, I mean, it's, and then if your paper didn't match your outline, then the teacher didn't like that. So you just learn, okay, fine, I'll do the outline after the paper. This is planning, this is not outlining. The point of it is for you, it's to help you. Your plan is not graded, but when I read your essay, it becomes painfully clear if you didn't plan. And again, it doesn't go down because you didn't plan. It goes down because your idea development wasn't there. There's no organization. You're not proving different points in each paragraph. I have clear, different points for each paragraph. Every paragraph has a goal or a claim that I'm making. And that's part of how I can move forward with confidence. If I say, I'm going to talk about da-da-da-da-da-da-da, I don't have any confidence with that. You need to directly state your claim. Don't tell me what you're going to talk about, because that leaves so much room to just ramble aimlessly without purpose. So you need to clearly define the purpose of each paragraph. And that's why, even though I already had it pretty clear, I still wanted to say, okay, but when I actually have to sit down and write the essay, what is the sentence I want to use? I didn't leave it in idea form. I put it in sentence form, and that's what you want to do in your plan.
I feel like 50% of this is just understanding what the prompt is saying.
Yeah.
And 50% of it is like coming up with ideas.
Hence, obey the prompt. Anything else? BJ, did I answer your question? Okay. And we'll do this again. We'll do this with some AP prompts so that you can see, like, this is for, again, sort of an analytical interpretation of a piece of literature. But when it comes to AP prompts, right, like once we're done with 1984 and we do some more AP prep, we'll throw these up. And if at any point you're like, you know what, it'd be really helpful if we just sort of got to see the way that Ms. Gellin goes about it, you can always request it. So what I thought I would do for you for homework is I have 2 more prompts for you. You don't have to do anything with them. This is just if you want to practice more with the questions. Again, just different prompts. Is not the test prompt. But if it's something that practicing planning is something that will help you, maybe setting a timer on your phone to see how long am I taking the plan. Again, I think 15 minutes sounds about right for a 15-minute period. If you're taking 5 minutes, I'd be worried that your ideas aren't developed enough or that you're missing some sections of the plan that would be really helpful, like getting the examples and that kind of thing. But you can't take a half hour either, because then you leave yourself only 20 minutes to write. Good?
I mean, no, but like,
Okay, well, what question would help you feel good?
is there any like black magic voodoo you can suggest to help you with this test?
I would suggest coming in with a warmed up brain. Again, to me, like, any other day in class, like to me, one of the first ways I would say Orwell defines what it means to be human, I would say selfish, right? That he defines us as selfish beings. But because I wasn't warmed up, I haven't been talking about 1984. So the other sections did the drawing thing. So really, they did much more talking today than I did about the book. This was really the first class I did today of talking about the book. So I think if I came in warmed up, I just would have been able to crank it out faster. So come in warmed up.
Study hard.
Seriously.
Use.
Oh, and it's first period.
Oh.
At least you're not like coming from science class. Sometimes it's hard to sort of do that shift.
I don't know.
Oh yeah, I have.
We're doing like,
No, I make U.S. history before this class a lot. So
But not Friday.
that's true.
So come in warmed up. You might even save one of the prompts for Friday morning. That would be a good warm up.
Before the test.
Yep. You got to school early on Friday and like sat at 7:30 with a couple friends by your locker, and it was like, okay, we have 15 minutes to plan, go. And then you did it, and then you sort of just talked to each other and make sure you understood the prompt and talk about your ideas. That'd be a great way to warm up. Okay? All right, so come in next time with a bunch of paper. You are providing your own paper. And you need your writing utensils and a computer if you have clearance.
God's faith.
Is it
Have a good day.
Is it open book?
Oh,
Okay.
I asked that the first 5 seconds of this class. It's like,
Okay, well, I
See you
don't have
guys.
a memory.
hold on, wait. No, you weren't in the frame. Hold on. Here you go. All right.
the best part of that video.